word legend gets thrown around a lot these days, but Shinji Mikami can certainly be counted among them. Not only did he help create numerous Stone Cold classics, he's collabed with many other creatives in the video game industry, most notably Grasshopper Manufacture on two of the most well-known titles, Killer 7 and Shadows of the Damned. He and Grasshopper CEO Goichi Suda are like two peas in a pod. Slightly unhinged peas, mind you, to be able to create such unique and memorable worlds. If you've ever wanted to know more about the creation of said worlds, though, you can do so with Kill the Past, 25 Years of Grasshopper Manufacture, an official and comprehensive tome collecting a quarter-century's worth of never-before-seen art, design materials, and interviews derived from all over Grasshopper's fan favorites. From Silver Case to No More Heroes to even Michigan Report from Hell, Kill the Past is the definitive work on everything Grasshopper, and is currently up on the Lost in Cult website for pre-order in both standard and deluxe editions, with a limited amount signed by Suda51 himself. And if you use my code MUSCLES at checkout during the pre-order period, which lasts until October 18th, you can nab this piece of Japanese gaming history for 10% off. I'm a huge fan of the studio and Suda himself, as most of you should know, so I'm beyond hyped for this release. And if you are too, hit the link in the description and pin comment below so you can kill the past as well. Thanks again to Grasshopper and Lost in Cult for sponsoring today's video, and for you out there looking at your monitors or phones right now, it's time to let the bloodshed begin. Start the show. Hello and welcome to another fact-pelting and mind-melting episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that, for the next 4 weeks, will wade knee-deep into the terrifying tales of horror and horror-adjacent entertainment. And really, it's hard to talk about horror video games without your brain immediately jumping to the legendary Shinji Mikami, the triple threat creator, producer, and director who worked on such classic franchises as Resident Evil, Dino Crisis, Phoenix Wright, and most importantly of all, God Hand. Now, if you'll recall my episode on God Hand, you'll know that Mikami had grown tired of Capcom's managerial style circa 2006, and sought to break away to work with like-minded creators, but under less oversight, which is what landed him at Platinum Games to make Vanquish. Eventually, however, he sought to open his own studio to mentor the next generation of game designers, but to kick things off, he had to return to his roots. No, not those roots. Those are the ones. But sadly, due to a cornucopia of reasons, some in his control and others not, his return to the horror landscape was a bit, bumpy, and from the looks of things, won't be continuing anytime soon, or possibly at all. So grab your edgiest crossbow and stock up on some bubbling green goo as I answer the question, what happened to the evil within?
It's been a while since your last visit.
Now, before we dig deep into the meat of this story, I have to give my thanks to Jason Bergman, a former Bethesda employee who worked directly on The Evil Within, who was kind enough to speak to me for today's episode. He talked freely and quite positively about his time on the project, helped me fill in some of the blanks, and gave me some valuable insight on The Evil Within's development. Around 2008, Bethesda, or rather its parent company ZeniMax, was opening branches all over the world, and identified Japan as a region that would see steady growth. So basically, the opposite of what Inafune had thought. To run this new Japanese branch, they hired Tetsu Takahashi, who had previously worked at Capcom in the early 2000s, but in a very specific role. It had been his job to oversee the various releases and localizations of Western games for the Japanese market that Capcom had licensed from others, such as Grand Theft Auto, God of War, and even Call of Duty. Takahashi and Mikami then reconnected years later after he had left Platinum, and before you knew it, ZeniMax was bankrolling the founding of Tango Gameworks, intertwining the two companies together from the very beginning, for better or for worse. While you might assume that Tango's first inclination would to be at least lean towards horror, Jason confirmed to me that wasn't really the case. Mikami was free and open to other ideas and genres, and it would actually take quite a lot of back and forth and false starts before they would hone in on what their inaugural title would become. Once they were acquired, Mikami pitched a whole lot of concepts, but none of them were greenlit. There was definitely a sci-fi game. It took place on the moon, if I recall, but I don't remember much about it. I don't believe it was horror at all, and never got beyond a very vague paper concept phase. Only one concept made it to a prototype stage, and that was a third-person action game, again, very much not horror. It was mostly a test for the team to get used to working with id Tech. There was a fun two-level prototype created, but it was again never greenlit. This was further backed up by Mikami himself. In the foreword to the official Evil Within art book, he confirmed that things did indeed start off quite differently, and that originally he had his eye on a more sci-fi-esque concept. The project continued on like this for a while, with more pitches being rejected until eventually the pressure started mounting to come up with a solid concept, and it seemed more and more that only one style of game was going to get approved. This pressure, of course, affected Mikami the most, and while his intentions to make something new and unexpected were admirable, for Tango Gameworks to come out the gate swinging, he would need to once again return to the world he created. He would need to return to the world of survival horror. With Bethesda upper management having rejected the last few pitches from Tango, I asked Jason straight up if he felt there was an outside push for Mikami to simply deliver what he was best known for, which would be the dread and thrills of Resident Evil, to which Jason strongly agreed. There absolutely was pressure for Mikami to create a Resident Evil competitor, for a variety of reasons, as you can imagine. First, because he's the father of the survival horror genre, so obviously that's what management wanted from him. But also, you have to remember that at that time, Capcom were moving away from survival horror with their RE games, specifically looking at Resident Evil 6. It was believed there was a market opportunity for a return to form for the genre. The issue, however, was that everything created at Tango up to that point was quite eclectic, essentially a smorgasbord of assets, which put the team at a bit of a crossroads, but fortunately one that Mikami would come up with a way to navigate. STEM was a very clever solution to the problem. I want to be clear here. Mikami is a creative genius, and he's a perfectionist who knows what he wants. The problem is that he doesn't necessarily know it until he sees it. When it was first pitched and put into production, The Evil Within was going to take place in, I believe, 18th century Spain. It was going to be open world, contain side events like fishing. It was going to be a very different game. Then they swung in a totally different direction and modern day assets were used. At some point though, you've got to make a game, so from a production standpoint, you've got all this stuff flying around. What do you do with it? Enter STEM. Suddenly, all that anachronistic stuff makes sense, or at least some semblance of sense. If you're flipping through the mind of a killer, you can go to totally different time periods and locations in the blink of an eye. It was a very clever way to make use of everything they had created. So yeah, the heady and complicated narrative device of delving into somebody's mind via a futuristic bathtub was created as more of a necessity rather than anything else, as it absolutely salvaged a good amount of time and effort. With the concept settled upon, Ikumi Nakamura also had joined the team and lent her character design expertise into creating some truly memorable enemies and bosses, some far more horrific than anything seen in Resident Evil up to that point, something Mikami praised her for in the pages of the Evil Within art book. While these solutions definitely helped the design of the game, there was still the issue of the actual technical nuts and bolts, as Tango, being a brand new startup, had no proprietary engine or tools, as most of the engineers had come directly from Capcom and elsewhere. This, of course, is how id Tech 5 came into play, an engine that had evolved significantly from techno-wizard dork John Carmack's interesting but ultimately fruitless effort to make mega textures the next big thing. Using id Tech was essentially the only option Tango had for two reasons. One, at the time, Unreal technology had struggled to make any headway in Japan, and two, even though there would be a guaranteed learning period on how to best utilize it, opting for id Tech would ultimately take less time and money than building their own custom engine. Even with that though, Tango did spend time customizing the engine to fit their needs, and struggled even more in just finding the right employees who could help them do that. Over the years, the biggest issue was simply finding developers in Japan. In the Capcom days, you'd hire a game designer, and whether or not they had experience with specific technology was irrelevant. Literally, nobody in Japan had ever made a game with id Tech, and even worldwide, that number was minuscule. So it was always a learning curve for new hires, and it wasn't easy to lure a designer from another company to work on a game with unknown technology, especially in Japan. When the game was first publicly teased, it was simply known as Project Zwei, a subtle way to hint that there would be two different worlds to explore, although that would be lost on most people until the STEM system was formally revealed. While the team continued working hard, their valiant efforts to come to grips with the technology still resulted in some technical issues that would plague the project until release, and even a while after. Specifically, one very odd quirk to its presentation that a sizable percentage of fans and critics took umbrage with. But it didn't stop there. Because of the design and tech problems which resulted from the things we've already discussed, this caused a delay to The Evil Within in general. This meant that it was now smack dab in the middle of a new console generation transition, and Bethesda wanted all those boxes checkmarked. But that was a task Tango Gameworks simply wasn't equipped to deal with. Already struggling with a foreign and very different engine and cobbling together assets and levels to work within the narrative, Tango simply didn't have the manpower to also start porting work to the new generation of consoles as well as the PC, so Bethesda would need to seek out another developer to handle the brunt of it. They would eventually choose Workshop Entertainment, a California-based studio best known for creating the PS Move exclusive title Sorcery, if you remember that one. This then created a more complicated three-way long-distance relationship between each company, Tango designing, programming, and sending the code and builds to Workshop in California so they could port to the other platforms, with Bethesda handling support and QA in between them. The addition of the Xbox One and PS quadruple ballin', Jason maintains, was one of the biggest hurdles they had to clear, as it complicated matters tenfold when both machines were running behind with documentation, support, and were constantly having their specs changed at a moment's notice. Even Sony, you might ask? Especially Sony, but especially Microsoft. This is not the first time I've heard that the launch of The One was a miracle, in that it actually happened, as several developers I've spoken to over the years have maintained it was one of, if not the messiest rollout they've ever seen. Jason therefore credits Mikami's decades of experience as to why The Evil Within came together in the end, as even up until launch, when the game was already ostensibly finished, he was still going in, having music, graphics, and effects tweaked and improved upon up until the 11th hour. When the game lurched and clawed onto store shelves in October of 2014, it didn't quite receive the unanimous praise reserved for a master that was returning to their craft. While certainly solid and thrilling in most respects, the game was plagued with technical issues across pretty much every version. Poor frame rates, slow texture load-in, and plenty of reported crashes. Then there was, of course, the infamous black bars, which were mandatory on the console versions and shot the action in a cinematic but also restrictive viewpoint. Jason confirmed to me these were not implemented for any technical reason whatsoever, and that Mikami just really liked how they framed the gameplay, and when Mikami liked something, he fought for it fiercely. Despite this, the black bars were made optional for consoles in a patch almost a year later, after much pleading and cajoling from fans. The plot was criticized for being needlessly dense as well, with reams of notes and cutscenes filled with technobabble that was at odds with the old-school horror thrills the game would regularly throw at the player. And finally, there was the overall sentiment that, despite it undeniably representing a brutal and terrifying vision, The Evil Within didn't really push the genre forward in any big way, unlike Mikami's previous groundbreaking work. Aside from a slight emphasis on traps, crafting, and the usage of a crossbow with multiple arrow types, it displayed very similar stop-and-pop gameplay and breezy straight-line progression akin to the Resident Evils of the day. Bethesda, meanwhile, had bet that the Japanese market was about due for a growth spurt, but it would take a few more years for that to happen, as The Evil Within, or Psycho Break as it was known over there, failed to reach anything close to RE's popularity, selling only 176,000 copies across all formats. In North America, it managed to become the number 3 best-selling game for October, according to NPD reports, but it dropped out of the top 10 completely the very next month, which is never a great sign. While Jason didn't have hard numbers to share on how The Evil Within performed worldwide in total, it was enough for the relationship to continue, and thus a few projects splintered off as Mikami decided to take a step back. John Johannes, who had helmed the Kidman DLC and would go on to direct Hi-Fi Rush, was put in charge of a title that was first known as Project Gaiden. This was originally meant to be a standalone, lower-scope spin-off of The Evil Within, think Far Cry Blood Dragon, and was eventually given a bigger budget, redesigned, and became the direct sequel we know today. The team had learned a lot working on the first game and had taken in plenty of feedback, changing up how the player progressed in the now mostly open-world map of Union, implemented smoother controls in combat, further polished the visuals and performance to the point it had been so customized they redubbed it the STEM engine, and was now all wrapped up in a far more digestible plot. It's curious then that The Evil Within 2 sold worse than its predecessor, with reviews not averaging out to be much better either, although the commercial performance could be explained by the fact it released 3 days after the anticipated Shadow of Mordor sequel, as well as Assassin's Creed Origins and Bethesda's own Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus just 2 weeks after that. There was, however, one other project that Tango staff split off onto once the first Evil Within had wrapped, and that was Snowfall, which took inspiration from Japanese mythology as well as adopting Unreal Engine 4, which was starting to be utilized in Japan by that time. This then, of course, became Ghostwire Tokyo, and was at first directed by Ikumi Nakamura, although she decided to leave Tango for personal health reasons in 2019. While Ghostwire was praised for its scenario, enemy design, and expansive map of Tokyo, it was at the same time criticized for falling into the same trappings as many other Western-made open-world games, although I personally thought it was a banger. There is one last thing I had to clear up with Jason, and that's this article right here. GameSpot claimed that they spoke to an unnamed someone on the Ghostwire development team who stated the game began life as The Evil Within 3. While Jason left Bethesda just as Snowfall began development, he doesn't believe this to be the case, although he can't say with 100% certainty. While it was meant to be a new IP in the very beginning, with its inspiration coming from Eastern supernatural myths, Jason could see a scenario where someone within Tango might have tried pitching it as a theoretical Evil Within sequel after the fact, but it definitely didn't kick off like that. You can see the parallels though, as Ghostwire features many sequences where the player has to navigate through shifting, nightmarish hallways and impossible spaces, as it was a trick that both Evil Within titles regularly implemented. Lamentably, the story just kinda ends there. After the release of Hi-Fi Rush, which won multiple awards and fan adoration, Mikami felt the talent within the studio would now be able to create without him, and left to pursue new interests, although he later admitted he wanted to depart much earlier than that. But just as quickly, Bethesda and Microsoft decided to shut down the studio due to some invisible metric known only to them, as they never really explained their reasoning to any satisfactory degree. This resulted in a lot of shared heartbreak felt throughout the industry, as many Tango staff members expressed frustration and confusion on their timelines, as this decision evidently came very suddenly. With that said, I am at least glad to report in a very non-what-happenedy moment that the studio was snatched from the jaws of death at the very last second, as Krafton Inc., the publisher of PUBG, swooped in and bought the studio, saving the livelihoods of the remaining Tango staff. Of course, it remains to be seen how Krafton will utilize the studio, but since they bought the rights to the Hi-Fi Rush IP along with Tango, we can at least expect to see Chai again at some point in the future, but sadly, not Sebastian Castellanos. That's because Microsoft and Bethesda still retain the IP, and considering the last couple of years both companies have had, I don't see them resurrecting it anytime soon. Although, I'd love to be wrong. Tango was, thankfully still is, a very exciting, unique studio, and while their first title had to contend with a lot of issues to get to market, and the franchise on the whole never quite reached that upper echelon of success, it's amazing and quite rare that they were able to wake up from a potentially horrible nightmare to see another day. And if you know of any other spooky video games or movies with terrifyingly troubled developments, let me know in the comments below or enter the asylum that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!